What is the state of freedom of speech around the world? The UN has an expert who examines that, and he doesn't have much good news. Special rapporteur David Kaye also looks at the internet and social media. Is democracy under threat from all the disinformation and manipulation? And how do you police the internet without censorship and restricting the freedom of expression? Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Platforms enabling free expression of information and ideas? Or are we looking at something more ominous? Forces that are making serious public policy discussions more difficult and thereby undermining democracies. Should we consider social media as tools for keeping governments in check, or is it the other way round? The internet's been publicly available for around 25 years, but what started as a free, unregulated exchange of information has now morphed into a machine-like utility run by companies guarding their trade secrets and processing information in ways hidden from the public. All this comes with serious questions about control of information. Today on Talk to Al Jazeera, a conversation with David Kaye, the man tasked by the United Nations with the unenviable job of investigating the state of freedom of expression around the world. David Kaye, UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of expression. Thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. Let's start with that job title, because it might not mean all that much to people who are watching. What is a special rapporteur? Because I know you're not in charge of UN policy. You don't decide what the UN does.
That's true. So special rapporteurs are independent experts who are appointed by the Human Rights Council, which is the central human rights body of the United Nations system. And we are essentially appointed in order to monitor and to report on issues around particular areas of human rights around the world. My area happens to be freedom of expression. I do country visits, I converse with governments all of the time, and I do thematic reports on all sorts of issues.
So you investigate what's wrong and tell everyone about it?
Completely, yeah.
And in terms of freedom of expression, what are the rights of a global citizen and where do they come from?
So everybody enjoys rights to freedom of expression. This is a global norm. It's rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also a set of binding treaties, right? Treaties, international agreements that states are bound to observe. And it provides everyone with the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media.
Everyone, even in North Korea?
Everyone, absolutely. Now, that doesn't mean that governments are not interfering with those rights regularly, and governments do have a kind of acceptable range of restrictions for certain necessary things such as national security or the privacy rights of others. They can impose restrictions, but the fundamental right is available or should be available to everybody on the planet.
You say they have exceptions. That clearly is the problem, isn't it, sometimes, drawing the line on things like blasphemy or hate speech. What amounts to blasphemy or hate speech, for example?
Yeah, exactly. So hate speech is something that is in particular required by human rights law to prohibit. But it's not hate speech in some generic way. It's basically advocacy of hatred that constitutes incitement to violence, discrimination, or hostility.
Let me get your view of where we are on human rights and freedom of expression around the world. Last year I spoke to the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and she actually said that if you had that Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a new thing, and you tried to put it to the UN General Assembly, all the country members of the UN, she's not sure it would even pass.
I think that's a wise observation, actually. The norms that are in human rights law, they were established basically in 1948, and they are very serious reactions to what we saw in World War II. They're very serious allowances for all sorts of freedoms. And the problem that we see around the world today is that governments are increasingly interfering with all sorts of human rights, but in terms of my mandate, they're interfering increasingly with everyone's right to freedom of expression. This is, unfortunately, a global phenomenon.
Well, let's just get your snapshot. You've been doing the job since 2014.
Yes.
Are things going backwards in that period?
I think in many respects they are going backwards, and it's deeply unfortunate. And we see it in a variety of substantive areas. We see attacks on journalists. We see limitations on criticism of government. criticism of religious institutions, like you mentioned, blasphemy. We have seen increasingly efforts by political leaders, by governments, to restrict the kind of robust debate that we expect in democratic societies. We see an increasing amount of concentration of the media, particularly controlled by the state. It's been deeply problematic over the last several years, it's true.
If we look at your background and where you started, you spent quite a bit of time as a lawyer for the US State Department. You are an American. It's worth reminding everyone that over the last 70 years, right from that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the US has played a pretty central role in promoting human rights and promoting the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech. Is the current US administration under President Trump living up to that legacy?
I think there are a lot of concerning things coming out of the Trump administration or out of the White House. And I want to emphasize that, you know, the US government is not this one single entity. There are a lot of people, and there are a lot of entities at the state level, state and local levels around the country that are really deeply committed to preserving freedom of expression. But when you have a president who attacks the media on a regular basis, where he calls the media the enemy of the people, which I think he does for strategic purposes to sow doubt in the people's opinion about media and in the truthfulness of traditional reporting, I think that's deeply problematic.
But of course, in the US, freedom of speech, freedom of expression is protected in the US Constitution. It isn't in all countries around the world. So what example does it set, those comments from President Trump to other leaders?
I think that's right. I mean, I think that it's a rhetorical stance that at the end of the day, US courts are likely going to stand with freedom of expression. I think that's true, and I think that's absolutely something that we need to clarify. But the rhetoric, I think, gives some comfort to authoritarians.
There is no freedom of expression in North Korea.
Exactly.
Tell me what your view is of that country. I bet you haven't been able to go on a visit.
No, I haven't gone on a visit. I mean, North Korea is a closed society. Remember when I said that Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights protects everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas? You can't get any of that in North Korea. People cannot receive information. They can't even seek it, right? In part because it's closed to the internet, for example. So what we think of as seeking information is maybe going online and browsing. That's unavailable to North Koreans. Their ability to criticize the government, which should be fundamental to any democratic society, is completely unavailable in North Korea. It's unavailable in other places too, but North Korea is really the single worst example in the world of repression and really totalitarianism when it comes to all sorts of issues.
That's the worst country in the world. May I give you what might be the worst case in recent history, and that's of someone being targeted for their words, and it's the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, brutally murdered.
Yeah.
Are you happy with the way the world has responded to that?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, if you look at the reaction since, we've seen, on the one hand, Turkey has provided some information, but mainly through intelligence services and to journalists in kind of dribs and drabs. So although I understand Turkey's position, but more concerning is, one, Saudi Arabia has not done anything to acknowledge not just the killer's responsibility, but the responsibility of the government at the most senior levels for this killing. So that's one deeply problematic issue. But the other one, the broader one that I think is in some respects more concerning, because we expect democratic societies to stand up, is not virtual silence, but inaction in the face of this. There has been no effort, for example, in the UN system by states to seek to censure Saudi Arabia, except in one instance led by Iceland, actually, in the Human Rights Council. Except for that, in an informal way, there's been very little censure of Saudi Arabia for its role in killing Jamal Khashoggi, and I think that is frankly, a travesty.
Do you believe the UN Secretary General, because some experts do believe he had the power himself to set up an investigation?
I understand that there are some legal questions around his capacity to do that. I think what we needed to see essentially is some request of him to do that. Once a state requested that, I think it would have changed the nature of the issue, and there was really no request for that. And if there had been that request, then I think that it would have been in the Secretary General's power or in other institutions' power, whether it's the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, to set something up. Now, one of my colleagues actually did conduct a visit, an official visit to Turkey in order to investigate the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, but there was no backing behind her of the
This is the special rapporteur for extrajudicial killing,
exactly.
I think, Agnes Callamard.
Exactly.
She didn't really have any power, did she? She had no investigative power at all.
Exactly. All she could have essentially was the discretion afforded her by the government of Turkey, inviting her in to conduct her own investigation. But with the absence of the UN system as a whole, the absence of states actually providing a kind of momentum and pressure on Turkey and on Saudi Arabia to cooperate, I don't think we were going to see anything more. And it was valiant effort of hers to do it, and a very important effort, but it wasn't connected to what states really need to do to hold people accountable for the killings of journalists.
She hasn't yet reported. Are you hearing that she has found any new information, or will the main effect of her inquiry be to show up other people who haven't done one?
I think that her report will be really important for people to see in terms of both the lack of activity by states, but also I think that it will be important in showing the kinds of things that states should be doing moving forward when we have these kinds of just very, very serious attacks on journalists and activists and others.
And this journalist, of course, was a legal resident of the US. Mm-hmm. Has the US done enough?
I don't think they've done anything. So, I mean, the question of the United States actually engaging in this has been, virtually nothing. I mean, what we have seen is, these allegations of a close relationship between Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, and the leader, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and that is providing a kind of protection for the Saudi leader. That is deeply problematic. It is showing, in many ways, a reluctance, not to mention a refusal, to engage in this incredibly important question.
I know as a legal expert you would want to see all the evidence, and you're looking at this from afar. Mm-hmm. But from what you can see, and given the chain of command in Saudi Arabia seems to be pretty short, mm-hmm. would you believe that the Crown Prince is legally culpable here?
I mean, I think that's absolutely a question for some kind of criminal investigation. But as far as we can tell from everything that has been disclosed so far, all of the threads lead back to the Crown Prince. And whether it is a direct ordering of the killing, or it's a responsibility because of not indicating that wasn't what he wanted to happen when he knew it was a foreseeable impact of this attempt to get him in Turkey, he's responsible. I think that seems pretty clear. Whether it amounts to criminal culpability, I think is a question that I would really like to see handled by the structures of the UN system.
It's already clear from our conversation that the issues of freedom of expression are a very difficult, thorny subject. They get even more difficult when we go online, and I know this is a subject of a new book of yours. We have it here, Speech Police, the Global Struggle to Govern the Internet. Let me talk to you about that. Let me start at the beginning of the Internet. Mm-hmm. It seemed like a utopian idea for freedom of expression, didn't it? A democratic place where everyone could say anything, where everyone became their own publisher.
Yeah, absolutely. And people, I think, look back on that Internet of, not that long ago, 15, 20, 25 years ago, as a place where you would go to blogs, for example, and you would look at one essay or argument, and it would have hyperlinks in it, and you would go to another and another, and suddenly you had discovered a whole world of information and ideas without even knowing it. And that was a world that we could think of as a kind of flat internet, right? An internet in which it was very difficult for governments to impose restrictions. But that internet is gone. We have an internet now that is highly centralized by major platforms, whether it's China and its WeChat, or it's the global power platforms of YouTube and Google, Facebook and Twitter. And those give companies the ability to restrict expression, but it also gives governments the very serious ability to identify where exactly to go when they want to restrict speech. It's easier to go to say, Facebook and say, take down this page, rather than to identify some blogger who might be very difficult to find online. It has made, the internet in the last 15 years has made censorship easier, rather than really allowed us to reach what we had expected at some level, which might have been a naive expectation of a nirvana of free speech online.
So explain to me how the user experience has changed. I go back, I'm old, to the old days of a daily newspaper, turning the page and not knowing what to expect on the next page.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the social media companies know the stories you like and keep feeding you the same story. So if you take something very niche, even if it's extremist, even if it's hate speech, they'll keep sending it to you.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the internet has become, particularly because of social media and because of, you know, the desire of the companies in order to make money, and that means in order to sell our attention to advertisers, they need an internet that engages us. And what that means is that we are continually fed news streams. We are fed information that algorithmically, right, the platforms think this is what this person will want to see. It's very different than your experience with the newspaper. It's also very different from the old blogosphere, where you might follow your curiosities. Right now, the internet comes to you rather than you actually going to the internet and exploring your horizons, essentially.
Let's use a real-world example. Myanmar in the summer of 2017. There you had the repression against the Rohingya community. Basically, there was ethnic cleansing going on. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights described it as that. And there in Myanmar, people tend to use Facebook a lot, perhaps because they distrust the state media. In the past was always propaganda. Tell me what they were finding on Facebook in that period.
So Facebook, you're right, Facebook is the internet in Myanmar. And what people were finding, and this is really a demonstration of platform power, because they weren't just the internet, they were the media. They were the way people were getting information. Social media was the way people got any kind of information. And what many people were finding, and what was becoming more and more prevalent on the platform in 2014, 2015, was incitement to violence against the Rohingya community. And Facebook really did not do anything in the face of that incitement to violence, even though that was inconsistent with its own rules for participating in the service. And that, I think, well, the UN has actually, in a commission of inquiry, determined that that ability to use the platform to incite violence was one of the initiators and motivators for people to go out and exercise terrible crimes against Rohingya in the period of 2016, 2017.
So are these companies failing? Perhaps you could explain to us how they try and police the internet.
The companies, it's really interesting in the sense that the companies are extremely powerful in various environments around the world, but at the same time, they've also become governors of space. They have bureaucratized the space to such an extent that they have rules, they have mini legislatures, they have all sorts of mechanisms to determine when there is a violation of a particular rule. And yet, we still see massive kinds of harms that take place on their platforms. And it's a real question that whether the companies are consistently enforcing the rules. And the major problem here is that we don't know, right? We don't know because they are not transparent about their implementation of their rules.
In your book, you talk about disinformation. Potentially, democracy is also under threat here. You mentioned two examples, the 2016 US election and the Brexit referendum in the UK. How worrying could this be for the future of democracy?
I think it's extremely worrying, although the disinformation problem in particular is very difficult to solve. And I want to start by saying that one of the fundamental problems in the disinformation space is the willingness of political leaders, and that is government leaders who should know better, who are amplifying the voices of disinformers, of conspiracy theorists and others. So this is a problem that is both amplified by social media, but also amplified by outside leaders who I mean are outside of the social media context. But the companies could very well identify rules for how they deal with disinformation, and then undertake enforcement that is not essentially censorship. They can slow down the amplification of that kind of information. They can do all sorts of things that use technology to deal with disinformation. They are trying. I admit that they're trying. But when we look at the world of disinformation, it's very hard for them to be in a position to know this information is false, this information is true. And we might not want them to be in that position either.
Do the companies need more government regulation, or does that lead to yet more censorship?
I think this is a time where we should be thinking about government regulation, and I think it could come in a variety of forms. One should be government regulation to ensure transparency of the companies so that we, the users, can really have insight into what the companies are doing in order to keep their platforms safe for the exercise of human rights. Another is an idea that has really taken on some momentum in the United States, and that's using competition policy, tools of antitrust to possibly even break up the companies. But if we go down that route, we absolutely have to have a conversation about what that kind of breakup of the companies would mean for users around the world. Because remember, Facebook, as an example, has about 2.5 billion users. 85% of them are outside the United States. So any kind of tool or regulation that might be adopted here has to take into account the global users and what the impact of any kind of regulatory measure would have on them.
Looking forward, is technology going to make the problem better or worse? We had a recent example of the US Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and someone manipulated her answers in a press conference and made it sound like she was slurring. There is now, I believe, early versions of technology that can create video and make people's lips move to say things they didn't say.
This is one of the threats to the future, and unfortunately, we see government leaders amplifying those very disinformation tools. So the example of Nancy Pelosi's doctored video, the one that made her look to be slurring, on the one hand, that's something that actually Nancy Pelosi could deal with, and she did deal with it. It wasn't necessarily something that Facebook had to take down for purposes of protecting her as a public leader. And frankly, we might not want the company to be in the position of taking down content that mocks political leaders. That's part of robust debate, is being critical and even using satire and mockery from time to time. But the problem that you're really getting to on this deep fakes question, making political leaders look like they're saying something that they're not really saying, is a very significant threat to the future. And what we really need is a commitment from governments to avoid using those tools. And we need a commitment from the companies to find technology solutions, if not to take them down, but to at least identify when those kinds of videos might be out there so that they can be appropriately labeled and identified as potentially fake. This is a problem. I mean, this is a problem for many, many reasons. It's a problem because it's hard to define truth from fiction, and particularly online, but it's one that we can't shy away from, and it needs all stakeholders. That means the companies, governments, and users to act in a responsible way to define how to solve the problem.
But it does mean unscrupulous leaders in various countries around the world can use this whole issue and dismiss things with that awful term, fake news.
This is a fundamental problem, and this is what is perhaps unusual, maybe going back to your initial question, that this particular moment is especially problematic and difficult because we don't seem to have, I mean, apart from countries here and there, we don't seem to have a coalition of countries who in good faith want to solve these problems, who want to do away with the amplification of fake information like the deep fakes, and who want to address issues like fake news or disinformation in ways that respect human rights, that respect everybody's access to information and right to access information, while also dealing with the harms. There does not seem to be a global governmental good faith effort to solve these problems.
David Kaye, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.